what I want to talk about is how is technology sort of dictating how we go about living our lives. This is what a camera looked like at the time American law jurisprudence was trying to tackle with whether or not you could photograph people in public. And the outcome of that was that basically if you can in fact photograph people in public without their permission. This is what a telephone looked like at the time American jurisprudence was tackling with wiretapping and whether or not you needed a person's consent to actually record their conversation. And it came out the opposite of photographs. It came out that in fact you do need a person's permission to record their conversation. And whether you need all the parties to the conversation or just one depends on which state you live in. But in some sense you needed permission. Does anybody know what this is? See how young people, old audience is? Just checking. One day I'm going to give this talk. Okay, so this is the Sony camcorder. And this came out in the 1980s. So because it didn't have a mute button, it meant that there was no way that people could record video and not record sound. And so one of the things I predicted, I said, look, you know what's going to happen is somebody's going to record video and they're going to go to jail for a felony charge for wiretapping laws. Whoa, I hear it now. That worked. Is it too loud? Whoa, down. How's that? Is that better? If it gets to, okay, he's giving me the thumbs up. Okay, and sure enough, that's exactly what did happen. There were these cases of various kinds of incidents. For example, there was a parent who put a video recorder on her son and used it to record how the bus driver was treating her son very poorly and captured the entire thing on tape. Now, for those of us who were parents, we're like, go! And then the police came and arrested her, not the bus driver, on felony charges. There was the example of a protest happening at Boston University, and someone began videotaping the police being very aggressive with the protester. And the police stop harassing the protester and turn around and arrest on wiretapping, for wiretapping the person who was videotaping. So nowadays, many other questions have come up around this clash between this dissonance we had between photographing people in public and recording them. But it all started with an interesting technology design decision, one for Sony having no camcorder. And today, almost every cell phone still has no mute option. So it reminds us that not only did the technology design happen, and we began changing our laws around it so that mothers didn't go to jail, and so that we can, in fact, videotape the police in the actions that they do in public, but we had to actually change our laws to make that happen, or change the way cases were interpreted. And so this means that technology is having a profound effect just based on the decisions that are being made. And so this is why I say this point about technology really is the new policymaker. Let me give you some other examples. This is a Sleep Number bed. It's an air mattress. And so basically the way Sleep Number works is you have these chambers, and you can basically, how much air you want to put in it determines how soft or hard the mattress is. And so that's the basic idea of how it works. Not a particularly controversial issue, except this is the new Sleep Number bed with Sleep IQ. Sleep IQ, you can pay for it and get for a few $100s more, and when you wake up in the morning, you can use your app to go see how well your night was, and it gives you an overall score of how good your sleep was. Now, throughout the night, it's measuring everything that happens on that bed. So for example, a 15-pound cat, okay, a little fat cat, it actually picks up his breathing and the fact that, and where he physically is on the bed. That's how sensitive it is. It picks up heartbeat and temperature and so forth in a bed. And the information that gets captured by the Sleep Number bed is not contained at the bed. It's not like I get to go look at the bed and see what's the answer. It's all shipped out through my Wi-Fi to go to a server maintained by Sleep Number that I then connect to with an app, which means it's information going outside the home. A design decision made by the company. This is the Apple Watch, and I have one here. And so the Apple Watch also is monitoring everything I do. It has quite a few different instruments in it. So for example, it can actually track where in free space my hand is doing and what movements it's making. It's tracking my heartbeat. It's doing a lot of the same kinds of things as the Sleep Number bed. But Apple made a different decision. The information on the Apple Watch isn't going to a central repository, but yeah, it even tells me when I need to move around. It isn't going to a central repository. Instead, the information is stored locally on my phone. A very different kind of design decision. And the impacts of those differences, whether the data gets shipped out to a central repository and then is totally beyond my control, or whether at least it's on my phone, it has a different impact on my own privacy and the issues that come with it. But notice I had no say in either one. So I think one thing is clear from all of these examples is that they underscore this idea that we live in a technocracy. Technocracy first came around and introduced the word technocrat, meaning someone who took a government position because they were the best in their field, as opposed to a political appointment or some other reason. But you know, the idea of having the best expert in education be the head of the education department. That was how technocracy was first introduced. And the biggest society of technocrats is actually communist China, where people are sort of a technocrat in a particular position. But I argue that we now live in a different kind of technocracy. I would call it technocracy 2.0. And it's basically where technology design is basically dictating how we're going to live our lives. Now, what's kind of scary about it is there's no master plan. It's not as though everyone in Silicon Valley has a plan, it's just how it's working out. And this kind of replication that we saw like with the camcorder, where without the mute button, everything that comes after it keeps the same design. And so this sort of replication is also happening. And so the question is, what do we do about it? And what else what other examples are there? I said that privacy was only the first wave, so let me give you some other examples. A couple of years ago, I was sitting in my office and I was being interviewed by a reporter. And we needed to look up an old paper. And so he types in my name into Google and to find the old paper. And when I clicked return, up popped some ads. And along with it came the result that we were looking for, the paper. And I said, well, here's the paper, click on it. And the guy says, oh no, I'm much more interested in that ad. Can you tell me about these arrests you've been having? And I said, well, I've never been arrested, I said. And so we began searching more and more, and we kept getting this interesting issue, that if I typed in Latanya with somebody's real last name, we would get these arrest ads. And so he's a white Italian-American guy, and he jumps to the conclusion that it's because you have one of those black-sounding names, he says. And I said, look, I'm a computer scientist. Computers aren't like that. They don't have these kinds of bias. There's no way the computer would do that. And so I kept playing around, and I noticed that, well, if you type in Latanya into images, you do, in fact, see black faces. And if you type in Tanya, you do, in fact, see white faces. And so the more I kept trying to prove him wrong, the more I couldn't. So eventually, I just broke down and said, okay, I took like a month and did an all-out experiment in which I captured 120,000 ad deliveries using VPNs from around the country, and was able to document that, in fact, these arrest ads showed up much more often with names with people whose first names are given more often to black babies than to white babies. And that the difference between those was almost 80-20. And 80-20 in this kind of context is very significant because the Department of Justice has a disparate impact assessment that they do, and they say, what is the difference? At least 80-20, and if it's 80-20, then in fact they would argue that it's a grounds for a discrimination investigation. So it's not that everything, just to kind of clarify, we discriminate all the time. We give student discounts, we give elderly discounts. The discrimination itself is not a problem. But historically, in American society, we have certain protected groups that we protect in certain situations, like housing and employment and so forth. And this particular issue was in violation of that because one of the things that potential employers do is they Google a person's name. And so if it's having this kind of disparate impact, it's actually impacting on one of our protected historical protections. There are many reasons that could account for this. So the way Google search engine worked is in this case, the company had put down 5 different ad texts that would show up, and they said if somebody searches for Ebony Glover, it had to be a first name and a last name. And it didn't matter whether or not the person had an arrest record. It only mattered that it was the name of a real person. How much they would pay if the ad's clicked on, and then the Google algorithm would choose one of these texts to deliver. The one that it chooses is the one that makes it the most money, which is kind of an interesting effect, because it could be that we were seeing this effect because of the choices that the company made. It could be that all 5 of these had arrest in them. Or it could be that a couple of them were neutral, but people tended to click more often on the arrest ads for black names and not as much for white names. So it's kind of, it began a whole conversation for several reasons, this case, around what became known as algorithmic accountability. The idea of how do I study an algorithm and know whether or not it's having a disparate impact or having a particular outcome, and if so, what should or could or is going to be done about it. And so the reason I show you this is because intent doesn't really matter in these cases. It just matters that it is in fact the effect. So I hope you agree with me, or at least allow me to go on anyway. We do in fact live in a technocracy, and that all of these types of values are up for grabs. So let me give you another example. The Pittsburgh Courier was once the country's largest black newspaper. And so whenever they wanted to give an ad like this one for Neiman's, they had a staff who would review the ad copy beforehand to decide whether or not the ad was appropriate for this audience. But today, the Pittsburgh Courier looks like this. It's a website, and Google primarily chooses what ads will show up on it. And so that's kind of an interesting shift around what kind of ads might show up and the fact that they no longer have control. And so one of the things that we became interested in is this effect at the FTC. So let me show you an example of it. This is the website for Omega Sci-Fi, and in 2011 they had their 100th anniversary. Now, a lot of people like Congressman Clyburn, Earl Graves, NSA executives, a lot of Michael Jordan, Shaquille O'Neal, a lot of really well-known black men have come through this fraternity. And so this was their 100th year anniversary, and the question was, what kind of ads showed up on their website? Well, there were ads for graduate degrees, and that sounded pretty reasonable. And there were also ads about taking vacations, and that sounded pretty good. But then there were also ads like this. And sort of these unwanted ads, implying criminal records and so forth. And then there were also ads for credit cards. So the FTC includes the ability to, the Credit Card Reporting Act is covered, the Credit Reporting Act is covered by the FTC. And so we became to focus on what kind of ads showed up here and how do they fit in the scheme of credit card ads. So we looked at on the far right are the most highly praised cards. The top praised card would be American Express Blue. On this side are the most harshly criticized cards. Cards that if you look online, people will always say, please avoid these cards at all costs. What you see highlighted in orange are the examples that only the ads for cards on the left showed up on the Omega Sci-Fi site. Which is kind of interesting because you could say then, where did the American Express Blue card show up? So now on the right, we see all the places that American Express Blue cards showed up. And oh my goodness, they look like a lot of educational sites, which only goes to beg the question even more as to why that ads never showed up on the Omega Sci-Fi site. So this again underscores the idea or the issues that algorithms are making decisions and that we somehow need a way to think about how do we hold them accountable? How do we assess them? So there's a good and a bad to that work. The good thing about that work is we began to see that we could use technology and experiments on technology to see what a black box piece of technology was doing. Was it adhering to the rules that we expect of society, or was it not adhering to them? And then began to think about how to address them. So let me share with you then another example. This is also work from the FTC. We were interested in, we've heard a lot of times people say, there is one internet. We all share the same internet. But we became really interested in the question of, well, is it really the same internet? Do we really have the same internet experiences? Motivated in the back of our minds is the Omega Sci-Fi example. What is everyone's internet experience really like? And so when we look at the internet, meaning all of the places that we use ComScore data, so we looked at all of the places that some number of households in the United States had visited and purchased from their entire online activity done from those machines, and we knew the demographics of those households, we began seeing some interesting patterns. So one pattern that we saw is that the first 10 sites roughly tend to be, everyone is sort of the same. Facebook, Google, and so forth dominate the top of the list for everyone. But after around number 10, you see huge shifts in which sites people visit more often, and they break down around demographic lines. So we created an index called the exclusivity index, which is the percentage of people in one demographic group divided by the sum of the percentages by all the other demographics. The closer that ratio is to 1, the more exclusive that domain is to that particular demographic. So what you see here are only two of the demographic of whether or not you have children or not in the household. And you can see it's a really bright divide, that there are places that people go when they have children that they don't go when you don't have children. And so the red line that you see going across the top there is 2 standard deviations up. So we consider something that's way up there very much more exclusive in terms of reporting. And so what kind of sites do they look like? Well, these are the kinds of sites that people who have children tend to go to, and people who don't have children have no idea what these sites are. Here's another example based on just race. Again, we see sort of a muddled effect. We see some that are rising very high up above the two standard deviation cutoff. And what do those domains look like? Well, for Latinos, Univision is number 1. And you kind of sort of looking at that list, you would think that makes sense. Similarly for Asian, I see India Times and Yoku and so forth, and that kind of looks right. Then if we look at blacks, we see World Star Hip Hop, but then number 2 is Foot Locker. And it's kind of interesting that a higher percentage of blacks visit Foot Locker than any other race. I think that's really interesting. It underscores for us that you can't always use the name as a predictor of which websites may be more exclusive to one group than another. And I'm certainly not going to even touch the idea that legacy.com is the most exclusive for whites. Yeah, that's another study. So if you know about that, people are experiencing not one internet, but there are different internets, there are different internet experiences, then this was very insightful as a tool at the FTC. So another thing that the FTC does is fraud. So now the way fraud normally works is we lose a lot of money, we report to the FTC, you lose a lot of money on the same fraud, you report it to the FTC. Eventually somebody notices, wow, there's a fraud out there that's costing people a lot of money. Let's go see if we can track it down. When they go to track it down, the fraudster is long gone. And so now it becomes a game of chasing that person down to try to recover some of the funds. And what we were able to show is that, and also the other thing that FTC had learned over time is that fraud is specific to ethnicity. So there's this fraud that we all see on our spam. That's peanuts compared to the fraud that the FTC typically deals with, which is very, very small. If somebody really wants to separate you from your money, they get into your trust network. Because the more they come from through a friend, through a church, through a school organization, the more likely it is you're going to trust them with a larger amount of money. And so these frauds tend to fit into these same kind of demographic groups that have different internet experiences. And so what we began doing is using the internet experiences to identify where the frauds are likely to occur. And so what you see in red were signals for which we believe we were highly successful. So that's a lot of the FTC work. Let's talk about another example. And what we're starting to see now are, on the one hand, they're kind of the same kind of creepy Latanya examples as always. But on the other hand, there's something a little different about these than my normal creepiness. What's different about these, though, is there's a kind of empowerment happening, a kind of use of the technology that allows us to see something that we didn't see before and do something that we couldn't do before. So let me give you another example. We were interested in all the places health data may go. And this is work I did before going to the FTC. And the idea is that so much of the data sharing is just hidden. You can't tell. Yes, I signed the data use agreement or whatever, but I have no idea who are all the people that you might be giving the data to. So we began tracking all of the places that the information may be going from a patient who visits the hospital. And we did this through breach notices and through Freedom of Information Act requests. And if you actually visit the site, thedatamap.org, and you click on one of these nodes, it lists for you the actual companies involved and the basis on which we made that determination. And then we began studying this graph. And so what you see here are some interesting things. Like, for example, the flows that you see in dark are flows that are not even covered by HIPAA, our medical privacy regulation in the United States. And that's kind of interesting that more than half of the flows aren't even covered by HIPAA. So that was kind of interesting. And then another thing that we saw was this discharge data. Now, how many people have ever heard of hospital discharge data? Okay, so most people have not. How many people have ever been to a hospital or gone to a doctor? Okay, you're in it, right? So most states passed a law that every time you go to the hospital or to a doctor's office, a copy of the information, primarily a copy of the bill, goes to the state. And the state then can sell or give away the information. And you can see that this idea of discharge data is contributing a lot of information in this data map to a lot of different places. I just want to point out, including my former employer, but that's another story. In fact, almost every state collects the data. 33 of the states sell it or give it away. And notice that big darkness over there for Washington State. But only 3 of them do so in a way that's as strict as HIPAA. Because they don't have to adhere to HIPAA, the other 30 states don't, and they use the standard that was less secure than HIPAA. So we were interested in, well, maybe HIPAA's too strong. Right? Maybe HIPAA's screwing up the data more than it needs in the name of anonymity. And or it could be that these 30 states have it wrong. They're putting people's data at risk. So for $50, I purchased a full year's of this health data for the state of Washington. And it came with about 300 fields of record for every hospitalization. At least 99.999% of all hospitalizations in the state of Washington in that year were in the data. This is a sample of the kind of data that I found there. It includes information about the hospital, the type of admission, how long the person was in the hospital, where they went when they were discharged, how they paid for it, what were the diagnosis codes, what were the procedures that were done to the person's age and month and year, their gender, the 5-digit zip code in which they live, and their race and ethnicity. And what we were interested in was not just only answering the question around the question of HIPAA, was it more revealing or not? We also had another agenda too. And that agenda was whether or not employers could be using the data, whether or not banks could be using the data, who could actually use the data to learn more information about employees or people to whom they've given credit. So we could ask ourselves, what does an employer know about someone who went to the hospital? Well, they know that they took time off from work, and they may actually, depending on how small the company is, they may know a lot more about sort of the procedure that was being done. They know the person's age, and they know their zip code. So they know quite a few things about they may know the general purpose. And so we said, well, how could we find that out about people here? How could we have the same kind of knowledge that a friend could know about you, or a family member could know about you, or an employer could know about you? And so we turned to newspaper articles. And Harvard's kind of cheap. They don't actually have all 5 of the archives that are of newspapers. They only paid for 1. So we only had the single archive that had about 8 newspapers that were saved for the state of Washington. So we had a sample that we could hit against. And so what we were interested in taking these kinds of stories of, in this case, a motorcycle accident, and we wanted to match it up and see if it matched exactly to health records. You know, and so what I mean by match, I don't mean it, I'm sorry, computer science, I don't mean anything interesting. I mean simply match, like straight match, like this word is there, this word is there, right? No probability, no computational linguistics at play, just a straight match. So we take the words, we extract them out, we say, does it match? If it matches one and only one record, we say that's a hit. And if it doesn't match any records, we take out one field at a time and see if it uniquely matches, in the belief that the newspaper may have gotten one field wrong. And so this was our criteria. So how does that matchup work? Well, so 60-year-old matches to years, Soap Lake Man matches to zip code. It happened on Saturday afternoon, and we know the date of the newspaper. The person's name in this case is Ronald Jameson. He had a motorcycle accident, and he went to that hospital. And so how well did we do? Well, we took the news stories, and then we went to public records to get, because they always talked about like Soap Lake City or a particular name of a city. So we translated that into zip code by looking up the person's name. And then we came over here and did our exact matching using the zip code plus the other information that was in the news article matched against the hospital data. And so we found that in about a little less than half, 43% of the time, we got an exact match. And that's exactly the kind of same information that employers know, creditors know, and so forth. Now, one of the things we did to confirm that we were correct is we gave all of the names to a reporter from Bloomberg News under the understanding that he and his editor agreed they would not report the name of anyone unless that person agreed to it. But on the other hand, we wanted them to contact everyone to say whether or not we were correct. And he was able to confirm that every single match was in fact correct. And they included congressional members, included professional athletes, it included businessmen, it included a lot of people who weren't that comfortable getting a phone call from a reporter asking about a hospitalization. Because one of the things that's hiding out in that data are things that have nothing to do with why you went to the doctor. So if there's drugs in your system, you went there because you got in a car accident, but that will still tell us whether or not there were drugs in your system. It will tell us whether or not you had sexually transmitted diseases, even though you didn't go for anything. You went there because your arm is broken, right? And so, so a lot of other kinds of information we're hiding in the data as well. So who's been buying this data? So we issued FOIA requests, this is a Freedom of Information Act request, to all of the states and asked, who have you been selling this data, who have you been giving it to? And here we really expected to see the universities topping the list. That is, you know, I know my colleagues are getting it all the time, public health, for many great, fantastic studies. And so in some ways, we thought this was kind of a duddy request to put all this effort into these Freedom of Information requests, expecting researchers and research universities to top the list. But that's not who does top the list. Who tops the list are the analytic companies. Remember the consents that we all click through, the click-through agreements that say, yes, I agree, that it goes to business analytic companies? Who are these analytic companies? Well, a lot of the analytic companies are the producers of data products. They make their money by making products that link data together in different ways. And so it wasn't, if you think about it, it's not so surprising to find data analytic companies topping the list. WebMD is on this list. WebMD, who gets a lot of information from people online. And now this is data that they're also getting offline. IMS Health is a prescription company that sells a lot of prescription data back to pharmaceutical companies and so forth. And so it was a bit of a surprise who was actually getting the list. Now, because I'm here in the state of Washington, I do want to tell you a little bit about what happened. So you can imagine one day, the person who is in the Department of Public Health gets a phone call from me that says, I've re-identified your data. It doesn't usually make a person happy. So but I have to tell you, she was fantastic. She was really fantastic. You know, I've given many of these phone calls and they don't usually go so well. But in her case, she says, look, I'm stuck between a rock and a hard place. I have to protect the privacy, but we have these laws in Washington state that require more transparency. And if I redact more data, I'm going to get yelled at and lawsuits and a lot of pressure politically that I'm trying to hold data back. And so she felt that the only way she could go forward was, in fact, if the law changed. So, in fact, the law changed. It was pretty amazing. And so now, if you try to get the data, the law has changed so that she now provides the data in 3 different ways. You can go to the website and you can just get aggregate statistics. You can still pay $50 and get this version of the same data set, but some of the fields on which this experiment was based are now been more aggregated. Or you can promise your firstborn child and get an IRB review and so forth, and they'll give you more detailed data. And so this sort of tiered access to data, I think, was a great outcome, because it doesn't stop anyone with a legitimate reason to get the data from getting the data, but at the same time, it doesn't make it as casual. So you would think then that instead of 30 states releasing the data this way, we would now have how many? Few, right? 29. So what can I tell you? It's one state at a time. So I claim that we live in a technocracy, that every value is up for grabs, that we can take the technology and harness it for good. And so does that mean that if we did it on a large scale, if we did it with you, could we in fact save the world? And so when I left the FTC, I was really interested in answering that question. How do we save the world? Because I'd left a big imprint on the FTC itself, and that imprint had to do with being a technologist and being able to unpack the technology from the business practice, being able to use technology to give us new insights into where the problems were that are of interest, like in the fraud example, and also being able to do social science experiments to show statistical evidence of problems that were occurring. And so that was the FTC while I was there. But how do we make this on a larger scale? How do we get So if the FTC wanted to start a Bureau of Technologists, who would they hire? Who knows how to do that? How do we bring them the masses? And the fever began to spread. It wasn't others in other parts of the government wanted somebody doing something like that for them too. And civil society organizations began saying, well, we need someone to do that for us. Or like, for example, they would say, that arrest thing was a discrimination case. We are the advocates against discrimination, but we don't know how to do that. We need technologists to do that too. And all of a sudden, I could see an alternative to the technocracy that we live in. One that shored up our historical protections by giving them the knowledge and the technologists that they need to do their same jobs. So I became really focused on that. I taught a class, and the students in the class did a project, and we expected about 3 of the projects to be good enough to take down to the FTC to show them to regulators. And in fact, I had made a sort of a bet with the students. I said, well, if any of you do a project that's good enough in consumer protection, I will take you down, I will fly you down, actually my actual words were fly you down to DC to meet with regulators. And in fact, we took 26 students. Yes, a budget buster. Especially because they reminded me about the fly part. But it was really an amazing experience. It was supposed to last for 2 hours. It lasted for almost 4. The regulators, who you have to realize many of the regulators are lawyers who are aging, and the students who are the closest to the technology, were talking about apps and problems that the regulators had not really heard of. And even if they did hear of it, they hadn't seen this way of thinking about it or exposing it or testing for it. And so it became pretty ecstatic for both the regulators, but also for the students who felt like they, in fact, had kind of saved the world, that they had had real-world impact. So we didn't want to lose that momentum. So we decided, okay, you know what we're going to do? We're going to polish up these papers, and we're going to publish them. And so we're going to have a new journal called Harvard Papers on Technology Science. And so I then reached out to 50 of my colleagues from around the world, and I said, look, we need people to help us vet these papers. And when they all said yes, without any of the explanation about the students or anything like that, when they just said yes, we realized that this is so much bigger than a Harvard thing. And so we launched this paper, this journal called Technology Science. And so let me show you some of the kinds of works that have come out in technology science. So one of them is by Daniel. Daniel is the one who wrote, he said, look, I can do you one better than your fraud by looking at these websites. I can track fraud for you in real time. Not something that you have to now go find the fraudster later. I'm going to use Twitter streams and track it in real time. That's a huge, big change shift for the FTC. Right? And so that was kind of cool. So his paper's there, and the technology has been given to the FTC. Another example were students who showed that when you visited Princeton Review's website, and Princeton Review, as you may recall, does online tutoring for SAT scores. When you visit their website, they required a zip code before they would give you a price. And so the students mined out all 32,000 zip codes, what was the price given for each of those zip codes by the Princeton Review. And what they were able to show was this kind of regional effect, that people who live in Massachusetts pay the highest possible price, and people who live in Washington State generally pay the lowest possible price. And clearly people in Massachusetts don't like that. But that's at this scale. ProPublica, Julia Angwin at ProPublica took the data and began looking at a much closer level. And when she looked at a really close level, it wasn't every zip code. In fact, it was the zip codes more often of Asians. And so that if you were Asian, you were almost twice as likely to pay the higher price. It's very interesting. And so ProPublica's paper is also on technology science. Another paper, this particular paper shows you that the same hotel, the same rental car, is different pricing. Now, we're all used to flights we're used to being on a plane where no two people pay the same price for the ticket or for that seat. But we're not used to hotels having such different prices, and we're not used to car rentals having different prices, depending on from what country I ask the price from. And so this is what gets documented here using VPNs. Two students of mine, different one. This is an Airbnb study. It showed, so there had already been an earlier Airbnb study in New York City that showed that if you were a black host, you tended to earn 12% less. Your prices tend to be around 12% less for an equivalent housing than white hosts. And so the students were interested in repeating this, but instead they chose the Berkeley area in California. And they were interested in comparing whites and Asians. And they showed an even larger effect that on average, Asian hosts earned almost 20% less than their white hosts for comparable housing. And so this is a pretty dramatic effect. And Airbnb has since contacted us about some strategies that they think will combat that concern. This is a study that got a lot of media. This was our first paper published. This was a study by Iran. Iran, for years, Facebook Messenger had a privacy leaking problem that whenever you sent out a message, it would give out your GPS location. And not to just your friends, it could be to the friends of friends and so forth. And so, oh boy, that was good. There, how's that? And so Iran decided to make this graphical. So he built a Chrome extension that visually would show you all of the locations of people who were sending Facebook Messenger text messages. And so as soon as he did that, 9 days later, Facebook changed it. They changed it where you had to opt in instead of it being on everyone. This particular story has also gotten a lot of traction because he had gotten a summer internship to work at Facebook. And so they waited till he shows up, and then they rescinded his offer. It's okay. He ended up with a better job and a lot of fame and articles around the world because of that story, and even an op-ed on Time magazine. So he's good. But I'm not sure Facebook was so good. They certainly did not win. This is also work done while we were at the FTC. What you see on the left are the top most popular apps, and what you see on the right are the domains to which it's sending personal data. And so if you visit the website, it'll show you for each of the domains, for each of the apps, what personal information it actually sends. But it's kind of amazing how much information is going and to whom it's going, and the fact that most of the apps are giving the information to third parties that you've never heard of. Another study, this is also by students who looked at Facebook privacy policy over time and measured it against these various measurements that were used on health data privacy policies, originally developed by Microsoft, PricewaterhouseCoopers, and patient privacy rights. But they applied it to Facebook's privacy policies over time to show what we all know, and that's sort of that the quality of their privacy policies were going down. And the only time it stopped that progression was when there was intervention by the FTC and public outcry. This is from two of my students who actually now have a company here in Seattle. And what they were able to show was that at first on the Affordable Care Act, the health exchanges, the large companies stayed out. When the large companies decided it wasn't going to go away and they decided to come in, they raised the prices by over 70%. And so one of the things that happened shortly after the paper came out was the Center for Medicare and Medicaid now requires more documentation. As I understand, it requires more documentation if an insurance company is going to charge a higher price. This is a re-identification experiment of that IMS health data, the people that I said is the prescription data. This is data that they collected from South Korea, and we were able to reverse engineer it to get what's equivalent of the Korean Social Security number or their national ID number. And similarly, we showed vulnerabilities. Another student showed vulnerabilities in Iceland's number using apps. And we talked about this re-identification. And we've also published some remedies, proposed remedies. This is sort of like the tier system that we talked about that Washington State adopted, but just on a more generalized scale. Now, what's really interesting about those, that's not even all of the stories that have been published. It's not even the most popular. It's not necessarily the most anything. It's just a sample. And we only started in August. So when I say that the world comes down to you and your ability to save the world, I really do mean that. Because these studies, every one of these experiments, a simple experiment, has had a huge impact. Just huge impact all over the place. And something that everyone in this room could do. So I'm going to stop there and open it up for questions because I sort of went on for a while, and that'll give us a little more time to talk. So now it's your turn. Any questions or comments?
What impact should this have on our curriculum?
So this is a great question. So one of the things that's kind of so normally when computer science joins another discipline, they create their own sort of body of work that then goes on. So for example, computer science crossed with biology has given us bioinformatics, and then it goes on to study it. And so this is that time in which computer science is often joining with some other discipline to tackle problems in an area, and it produces its own body or its own discipline, its own kind of problems to solve. This one's kind of a tricky one, this technology science, because there's no one discipline that could join with another discipline. If you look at the breadth of problems that the students address, some of them were done economic analysis, some of them were statistical analysis, some of them I didn't show, but they were algorithms that you had to either analyze or new technologies that had to be built. Some of them were legal analysis to make the case that this was actually in violation of a particular law. And so what makes that hard for technology science is that it's not as simple as taking two disciplines and fusing them together. And I can't even say that, gee, if you wanted to study discrimination, all you need is to take these two disciplines and put them together. Instead, the problem seems to drive who has the best tool to provide an answer or an insight into it. So your question about how do we train people is a fantastic one, that I have no idea of the answer in general, but I have an idea of how to get to the answer. So the way, while I was at the FTC, many of the government agencies said, how do we get people that can do this? How do we produce this workforce? And so I began a conversation with the National Science Foundation. And Keith Marzullo had the most insight around what this was like. He said, you know, it's like robotics. Many years ago, when we started robotics, he said, funding robotics work, people came from all kinds of disciplines. There were mechanical engineers, there were psychologists, there was just a huge collection of different disciplines coming together. And that's very difficult to accomplish at a graduate level, which is one of the reasons I'm very proud of the University of Washington. It's a very difficult thing to do at a graduate level. But Keith says, but the way they did it in robotics is they did it through the undergraduate program. So they gave research money, and then they would include undergraduates, and the undergraduates aren't tainted by disciplinary silos, and would tackle these problems fearlessly. And that's what we certainly have experienced with this. And so that's our path to getting there. But every school will march with their own feet. I know that you guys have a very different thing going on here, which I think is very special. Eventually, though, if it's to be a discipline, it will come down to a set of problems that are the most important ones to solve, and it will come down to some methods that are the most important methods to help solve those problems. That's what makes a discipline, right? Not, you know, but we're not there. I don't know what they are, you know, but I think this journey that the University of Washington was on well before I ever uttered the words technology science is a fantastic journey. And in fact, may very well have a huge impact on the future. there were a lot of questions in that. So one of the questions was basically, in the world that we're entering, the Internet of Things, isn't that like putting this on steroids? Yes, it's like putting this on steroids. So therefore, embedded in that comment is a kind of sense of hopelessness. So isn't the game over, right? Technology won, end of story, we now live in a different society. And the answer is no, because we don't know what that society is. We don't know how to live in a world where all of the values that people have died for and fought for and so forth just came up for grabs arbitrarily. Right? It's certainly not a democracy anymore. What actually is it? And that's probably not the way to get us there. It's usually through social movement and so forth. And if we allow social movement, it could end up being a revolt. In my heart and in my core, I'm a computer scientist. I love technology. So for me, the answer is, I want society to have the benefits of this technology. I want to enjoy my Apple Watch. I want to enjoy. I want to enjoy the Sleep Number bed without it sending data over to Sleep Number, right? And whoever Sleep Number sends it to. So the trick is to figure out how to harmonize technology and society. And that ultimately is the goal of this work, is to figure out where are the problem areas, how do I demonstrate the problem areas so that the right communities, public interest groups, whether they be advocates or whether they be consumer-facing government, can now perform their functions better. And more importantly, if we produce a lot of these technologies, it will be the companies themselves, because no company wants to spend millions of dollars to have their technology disrupted. You know, Intel Corporation, many years ago, built the Pentium chip. Many of you were quite young when they did this. They had this revolutionary idea that they were going to put a serial number inside the processor that went into the personal computers at the time. And their reason for doing that was simply, they said, look, if we could track every packet that left a particular device, then if you broke into a computer or if you did something or another, we would, through sales record, be able to know it was you. And so that they said, this is a great idea. And they had, and you know, for Intel to get a chip in, to get a serial number into a chip, to be able to fabricate the boards, to send the boards to Microsoft so Microsoft can use those features, happened a long time ago. At the time the president and CEO is making this announcement, the ships are already sailing from Japan and China back to the United States. The boat has left the dock. He makes this announcement. There's a huge public outcry. I mean, just a huge public outcry. And eventually, Intel stock began to go like this. And at that point, they abandoned the project. That cost them millions and millions of dollars. To this day, Intel is extremely sensitive around privacy, because no company wants to have the disruption. So that means that if we produce these technologies, the same ones that we talked about going into government, the same ones we talk about going into public interest groups, they also need to go and be product managers in the companies. Because there they can help navigate the technologies very early on away from these kinds of pitfalls. Right? So that's another answer to your question. You had other questions, but I'm going to talk to somebody else now. Well, so first of all, I'm a computer scientist. I'm not an advocate. So my job is to get society, and my personal goal is to harmonize technology and society. And so when technology is kind of out of whack, to demonstrate a problem and to then look to others to help solve it. Now, if you're asking me my opinion about it, for that reason, I don't have an opinion. But if you're asking me about the culpability in that particular experiment, so the options were kind of simple. Either the company had actually chosen to give 5 different strings on these names that were black sounding and 5 neutral strings on the names, or something like that. It may not have been 5 and 5, it could have been 4 and 1 and so forth. But they had chosen a disproportionate distribution of these terms, in which case they're responsible for this problem. And it does look as though, given how the actions came down and decisions were made, I guess the FTC also took an action, this was before I was there, against them, that was the outcome. But it could have alternatively, just for a moment for the point of conversation, been a different rationale. And that different rationale could be because the algorithm rewards every time society clicks the button, that it was a mirror image of societal values, in the sense that people would click the arrest ads more often when it had a black sounding name and click the neutral ad more often when it had a white sounding name. Now there, who do you say is responsible? Well, normally what we've historically said is it doesn't matter, it can't be. You can't do this. So the discrimination laws through the department that are enforced by the Department of Justice you didn't have to mean to do it. It didn't have to be intentional. It just means that the effect happened, and so it has to stop. And in that case, that would mean Google would be responsible. And so Google could easily calculate beforehand whether there's a disproportionate effect and weight the ad delivery accordingly as a way to offset that. Yes, let's get the way in the back. So we have a paper coming out in Technology Science by Arvind Narayan, who for those in computer science fame, was the computer scientist that showed the vulnerability in the Netflix data, the re-identification in Netflix. But the paper that he's coming out with in computer science is an ethical analysis of a technology. And I think that kind of paper is very powerful, because you had to understand the technology well enough to get into the ethical issues, and he does the ethical issues a lot of good service. And so that's a kind of merger of the community that you're talking about. At the same time, yes, right, technology science papers come from all disciplines, because in fact we can't say only these 3 disciplines get to play ball. There seems to be a space for all of them. And I think when you read Arvind's paper, you really get a good sense of, wow, I'm really glad he was in that spot at that time, that he knew this, and that he could share this and give us this insight. And so, yeah, we need a lot more people like that also. Arvind Narayan, he's in Princeton. It's not up yet, but check in a week. Well, this is a particularly difficult conversation, difficult issue. So let me first to level set why this is a difficult issue. So often I will say that Mark Zuckerberg could create Facebook in Cambridge, Massachusetts, but never in Cambridge, England. And the reason for that is the way privacy laws work in the United States. So basically, in the United States, if you have a naked body and the privacy law is a little circle each law is going to cover your body. In the United States, we have 2,187 privacy laws. They're little bitty circles, and they pretty much stack up on top of each other, leaving almost the entire body exposed. If you talk about privacy in the European Union, it's like a cloak that drapes the entire body. So from a privacy standpoint, one seems really comprehensive, and the other one seems kind of like the Wild Wild West. But if you're doing innovation, then because there's no privacy law forbidding it, you can do whatever you think is the right thing, whatever you think will sell, and it's good until it isn't, right? And if you're in England, and the first thing Zuckerberg would have to do is go get permission from the Data Protection Agency. Is it okay for me to hold personal data and use personal data and let other people see it? And you know what? That would just take so long and so laborious, he would just go find something else to do. And so this relationship between innovation and our piecemeal privacy laws is huge. It is one of the reasons innovation is happening here more so than elsewhere. So it's not as easy as to say we can look like Europe. Because if we look like Europe, then it's not clear. First of all, it has to go through a political process. It's not what we want. It's part of what you're asking me, what do I think can happen? And just politically, I just can't see that ever happening. I don't ever see a comprehensive privacy policy in the United States unless some huge disaster happens. It would have to be pretty catastrophic. On the other hand, there's the image of the Apple Watch. a different design decision, a different way to do something, a different market value on privacy. Technologies that people are thinking about developing in ways that empower the individual, giving the individual control. More and more we see examples of that on the research that graduate students are doing. And so I think that these things become game changers. So the game changers may have to come through that kind of market lens. Because right now the EU can cause a bit of obstacles, but at the end of the day, the EU wants the same technology. And so, you know, it has to be a change on the terms of the technology to be the biggest change in terms of consumers. Now we can shore up our protections, and that will be good at making companies think twice about things. We can put new people, technologists, into companies to help navigate products away from these problems. And I think that kind of thing will help, and creating a market value that's more gives the user more power and is more privacy sensitive in the case of privacy, I think is another way. But comprehensively, I think if that's your goal, that's a really tough call.
So much.